Hello, everybody. I am Michael DeVellis, and this is the Powder Group Conversations. We are with James Vincent on inclusivity and diversity. Before we get started, as I always want to do, I want to thank our sponsors of our Conversations program, Senna Cosmetics, Beekman 1802, Cinema Secrets, Omnia, Muse Beauty Pro, and of course, Skindinavia. Without these 6 sponsors, we could not be here providing complimentary free programming all year long for you guys with the Powder Group Conversations program. I want to welcome James. James, welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy Pride.
Thank you. Happy Pride.
I have to say, I think Pride is a very special thing this time around because we're kind of back as a community in so many ways, right? Our LGBTQ community is able to gather again in special ways. Our pro community and the makeup artist industry is able to gather again. We're all in this sort of celebratory mood, at least across the US and places that are opening up again. And I think that this idea, and I know it's so close to your heart, of diversity and inclusivity is so important. In this past year and a half, I keep saying year, but at this point it's been like 18 months plus, right?
Yeah.
It has been a really trying time for people. And it's been a really trying time, not only for people to sort out how they can participate in inclusivity, diversity, supporting communities of color, et cetera, but also how does that apply to our industry? And so what I thought we could do is kick off 4 weeks of LGBTQ focused programming on our Conversations program with a discussion about inclusivity and diversity. And as I always do, I like to ask a really generic question in the beginning. Why are inclusivity and diversity important to you?
You know, for me, inclusivity and diversity are essential to success, not only in an industry that's built on individuals and connection to individuals, but also as a human. I don't understand, I don't understand why inclusivity would ever be an issue. But the thing I think that happens is that people get those terms confused. The idea of diversity means that you are bringing in representation from a variety of backgrounds and narratives. And I use the term narrative a lot because I think that in the makeup world, it's our stories that really start to separate us, along with our skill sets and things like that. But inclusion is diversity without the tokenism. The idea that not only are we including different voices, different faces, different identities and expressions, but we are also giving them equal opportunities to get employment, to see themselves represented, to show themselves and share their stories. And I think in the beauty industry, as makeup artists especially, and estheticians who spend so much time so closely to individuals from various backgrounds, the understanding of inclusivity and diversity allows us to be stronger in building our business and our brand, but also in the way that we connect to clients, curate our work, and present ourselves in those public beauty spaces. And that perception of kind of designing and applying makeup on more people than just the people that look like us. So I think that for me, from my first step into the beauty industry, and everybody here I'm sure knows my story, I got into makeup because I was writing my dissertation on women of color and the white beauty myth. And for me, growing up in a family that is Portuguese and Cape Verdean and Italian and so mixed, my family has Narragansett blood, seeing cousins that were all different shades, but then not seeing them represented on magazines, in movies, in makeup. Having aunts that could not go to a department store and purchase foundation. That really kind of spoke to me. And I kind of have made it a mission in my makeup life to be able to talk about those things and create opportunity and expression for people. And I thank you and the Powder Group for giving me a platform from very early on to be able to do that.
I think, there's, you use so many important words in what you just said, narrative and tokenism. And I think that for a lot of people, it's a confusing time, right? Even for people who are hardcore LGBTQ supporters and allies, there's a lot of words. there's a lot of letters, there's a lot of initials, and there's a lot of things that people don't quite understand. So I think as a base for maybe talking a little more in a few minutes about our industry and how we can, whether brands or artists or people who hire or people or whatever, can be supportive. Can you give us sort of a James Vincent 101? Like, what does LGBTQ stands for? What does BIPOC stand for? What
Yep.
does intersectionality? Like, there's so many words. Can we go through a few of those?
Sure. LGBTQIA is the current iteration of the term, and it is a continuation of the LBT movement that started happening years ago. And the thing I want everyone to remember is that you do not have to be perfect with this. It's okay if you don't understand a word. It's okay if you have a question. You've just got to do the research, and it changes constantly. Language is living. And so we constantly have to update our terms. For me, when I was in college, I started with some friends, the first gay group for Rhode Island colleges. And we were a Rhode Island network of gay students. In the 90s, the idea that you could be rings, like how great, we all wore those freedom rings, it was the thing. But then a group of lesbians stepped forward and they said, we don't feel included in this. So we became Rhode Island network of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender students. And for me at first, I was like, ring BLTs does not look as good on a t-shirt, but it was important that people started to see and hear themselves, and the language changes constantly. When we talk about that alphabet, the alphabet people, right? LGBTQIA, what we're doing is trying to make sure that everyone is represented there. The other modern term that we use is the word queer, which is a word that I use a lot. Now, queer was a negative term that was no gay man I know has not had that word shouted at them from a passing car. It was a word that was used to kind of keep us in our place or bully us. And we've taken that word back because queer is more inclusive, because even people who are straight identified have felt other than. And so queer is a very inclusive word. Even though a lot of older gay men especially find it to be very negative, it's the modern terminology. Just like when we talk about when we're talking about people of color, this is a term that is considered to be the modern term because it's all inclusive from people that don't have such a close proximity to whiteness. The idea that people of color is an all-inclusive blanket statement. It can be problematic because it erases people's individual experience. So now we say BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because the Black experience, especially in the United States, has tended to be so different, and the Indigenous experience is so different that we want to make sure that people are feeling seen and heard. A thing to remember is the closer you go to someone's actual, the easier it is to not offend them. For example, when I was young, we would say someone was Spanish. And that was very common. If someone was Puerto Rican, Dominican, Colombian, Peruvian, someone would say they're Spanish. It was the language that many people even used to identify themselves. But now we know if you're speaking about someone who is Latina or Hispanic, and you use their actual lineage or culture, this is really where you want to be. And this starts from conversations with individuals, but knowing the terms that you can use when you're addressing a large group of people. This is the easiest way to make sure that you are being inclusive in your language and you're not offending anyone. But it is very easy to make mistakes. And so I say to people, think about your intent. If your intent is not to offend someone, to say, I will say in a group, and most people here have heard me present, I will say Black or African American, because African American does not include the island diasporas or the many African artists that we have in our industry. I'll say Black and brown skinned, because this is a more inclusive modern terminology. People of color sometimes feels like it comes from a place of privilege, even though we use that term. For many young Black activists, especially, the term people of color is too close to colored people, which is a negative. And so this is confusing for many people, but again, it comes down to intent, and really it requires us to unpack our own privilege. It requires us to do some work and research, and it requires us to be uncomfortable. And people don't like being uncomfortable, but when we're talking about inclusivity, diversity, and representation. We really want to make sure that our language is the least offensive. For example, when I say queer, but I see someone's reaction is, maybe I'm talking to an older group of gay men, I will change my terminology to say gay. When I am in a group of women that might be all expressions, I will say female presenting, or I will say makeup wearers, because there might also be male identified people. There are non-binary people who are wearing makeup. So it's little things that you can do with your language. It just requires you to understand your intent and to think sometimes and understand that language is modernizing itself all the time, especially in this age of social media. Movements like Black Lives Matter or all of the rallying against AAP I hate change people's perception of language and further that narrative. But the problematic behavior is when someone says, well, I don't get it, I don't understand it. Gay was good when we called ourselves gay. We see that especially with the trans narrative, when people who were leaders in the movement are all of a sudden being called out because they're using words that are no longer used. That's where there has to be a discussion. So the thing that you need to remember is with any movement, there is always a progression, and the people who are early stage in a movement tend to get left behind if they don't keep modernizing themselves. As we age, it becomes much tougher to learn new things. It's just the way that it is. But we saw it in feminism, right? The first wave was all about the right to vote and equal pay. Then the second wave was all about women's choice and equality in the workplace. Well, then the third wave came in, but they had grown up with Roe versus Wade, so they didn't have problems with reproductive rights. They wanted representation, and they would look at the initial feminists and say they don't want enough. We saw that in the civil rights movement. It went from the Malcolm X and years of the 60s, and then through the 70s and the Black Panther movement of activation and activism, and now Black Lives Matter is saying there is much more that needs to happen here, because movements grow and shift and change, and so does language. And so just to kind of bring it back to that, I just want you all to understand that it isn't necessarily easy for anyone. It requires you to commit to understanding, and there are going to be people, maybe even in this session, who will say, it's too much for me, and where I live, I don't need to think about it. But I do think that that's lazy, and I do think as someone who grew up in the margins, when I see people making an effort to understand their language and apologizing if they make a mistake, I think that goes much further than being perfect.
I agree. And I think that for a lot of people, and I know you and I, again, have similar upbringings, familial wise, mama's boys, family loves our gay husbands. Like, we are so welcome and supported in our community. But even within family, there can be confusion. And I think a safety net for me, and what I've expressed to my folks and to people in my world, is when in doubt, just use the LGBTQ terminology. Like, it might not feel right, nor maybe should it be right for a cisgender female to call a gay man a queer. Like, that might not resonate the same way. If in doubt, LGBTQ is much more respectful than saying gays or the gay community, because again, it isn't encompassing.
The little part there, it's the direction of language. So you wouldn't say someone is a queer. Right. You would say they are queer. You wouldn't say someone is a Jew. You would say they are Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's the other thing with language. Any person can use the language as long as they're using it in the right identifier. And that also comes from understanding. For a family situation, especially, because this is sometimes where it becomes the most difficult to actually kind of navigate language and identity, I think that it is always easy to ask and to tell. And I think when you're meeting new people, there are things that you can do, and we can talk about that, with how you can present yourself that will make it more comfortable for people to tell you what their pronouns are, or perceptions, or how they're presenting.
Let's jump in on that for a minute, and then talk a little bit more about how our industry has done with this and what else we can do. But I think that, that is also, and you and I know this, that's also a point of confusion for a lot of people, pronouns and they and we and all these pieces. Can you explain why it's important for people to understand what binary means, what fluid means, what all these pieces mean? Because for me, for someone who is just trying to work in this industry, and and I'm not being a smartass, who watches Pose and is like, oh, I think that's really amazing. They struggle, they went through this, and that has opened up, a community to people's eyes. But why is it so important that we understand pronoun use now?
I think it becomes important because it's a shift in history and culture. I think that there are words that we no longer use that can get people in a lot of trouble or canceled, or uh, even have people have legal action brought against them that were once very common terms. Language shifts as culture shifts. What we've seen in the last decade is that there is a shift against the binary. Our education is largely binary. I think we're seeing right now in the last 10 years the issues with the American educational system. But the issue with the binary comes because things are not black and white, good or bad. And things are not one way or one way. There is always a gray in between. We're seeing that with gender. We are seeing that with queerness. We are seeing that with the expression of BIPOC. We're seeing that with the Asian experience in the United States. We're seeing that with the way that we identify how children learn. One way to notice is the number of children that are now considered to be on the spectrum. When I was in school, those kids were lazy. They were bad readers. They were in the third reading group. They were problematic. They were special ed. Now we understand that every individual processes, receives information and processes and puts it back out in an individual way. That binary has shifted. It is the same thing with gender expression. I may be a fat, bald, tattooed, hairy guy, but there is a feminine part of my personality that I feel very comfortable expressing. And so my expression for most people might not be super masculine, but because of the world that I work in and the confidence that I put out there, people kind of accept it from me. I think when people get uncomfortable is when they don't know. But one thing you also need to remember, and lean in close as I say that, someone's gender is not your business. If they tell you they are they are they. If they tell you they are she. The easiest way to get around that is to always people's proper nouns or names. So if you are concerned that you're going to make a mistake, then you need to remember people's names. It's just really a change in language. And you will have English and Spanish speakers come out all the time and say, well, it doesn't make sense linguistically. There are a lot of things that change. Language changes. There are words that we no longer use. There are languages that die. And so language is a living thing all the time. We add new words to the dictionary all the time. We have to change the way that we play with language and that we kind of weave language through conversation. And so I would say, again, the easiest thing to do there is ask the question or put yourself in a situation where you're receiving the information that you need. It is uncomfortable sometimes for someone to say, hi, I am James, my pronouns are he, him. What you'll see in places like NYU and Harvard right now is that on every Zoom screen where it says our names, James, Vincent, and Michael DeVellis, it would also say he, him. In those institutions right now, when you introduce yourself into a group, you are asked to give your name and your pronouns. And so by normalizing that, it allows people to not be as uncomfortable. The idea that they is difficult is ridiculous. That the idea that people don't understand the they is ridiculous. If I told you that I am a tree and I identify as a tree, that's just like a ridiculous thing. And this is the argument that the conservative right has against it. Like with gay marriage, they would say, what's next? Marrying a dog? They go to extremes to make people even more uncomfortable with not understanding, because as humans, we don't like to not know. We don't like to be uncomfortable. But I promise you, if you put in just a little bit of work and you shift the way that you speak to people, then it will allow the change. You also can be very realistic. In a group like the Powder Group, which is very inclusive and very welcoming, we could assume here that most people have no problem telling you their pronouns. we could also assume that if you have known someone for a long period of time, that they feel comfortable knowing your pronouns. It's when you are questioning right now that the experts are saying introducing with your pronouns takes a lot of pressure off you to understand. But understanding and using someone's pronouns is a very different thing. There might be a journey in you getting to understand it or be comfortable with it, but that still doesn't excuse you from using someone's chosen pronouns.
You're exactly right. If you may not understand it, but you have to respect it, and you have to
There
respect
are a
their
lot of
desire.
religions that I don't understand.
Yeah.
There's a lot of political beliefs that I don't understand. There are a lot of social movements that I don't understand. But, being in Rhode Island right now and like kind of shifting, being in New York and Provincetown in Rhode Island after being in my apartment for a year, what I have started to realize is every person is an individual, and all I have to do is respond to that person as an individual and move my own ego out of the way. And understanding comes when you start to shift your own ego out of the way.
Not why, how can an individual makeup artist, like, everybody on this session with us, let's talk with that first and then brands. How can someone ensure, maybe they're not the hiring party, maybe they are a part of the team. How can they ensure that they are doing their part to increase inclusivity and diversity on their teams, within their community? Is it as simple as social media posting as a starting point? Like, what do we do as individuals to make sure that we are embracing inclusivity and diversity and making sure that we're doing the right thing in these cases?
I made a list. So I'm
I
going to go
love a
very quickly.
list.
I love a list. Educate yourself. Educate yourself in your own circle. You cannot call your Black friend and ask them questions about Blackness when they are in the middle of a Black Lives Matter movement. That is not their job to educate you. You cannot call your queer friends because it's Pride Month and say, explain to me what Stonewall is. You've got to educate yourself and do some of the research. The onus is on you. And you need to educate your family and friends. It is not the responsibility of the fight to get your friends up to snuff. If you are in a situation where people are using microaggressions or language that is inappropriate, you have to clearly stand up and say. An example of that is that, the word retarded is a word that I cannot stand. As a social worker, I think that is such a, I think ableism is one of the pieces of these movements that gets left behind so often. And, it's such a casual word that people throw around. And I have no problem saying, we don't use that word. Sometimes you have to police people's language because they don't realize to do it on their own. Bitch is a word that we use a lot as gay men, but I know that there are some people that have an issue with it. And so sometimes I'll say like, oh, I'm so sorry, whatever. And people will say, oh, it's not a big deal. Again, put yourself in a situation where you are the student and you're learning something. If it's not coming from a place of, being hurtful, most people will understand. Research, 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 and then listen. It becomes really important that when other people are speaking that you listen. You don't need to be the leader in every movement. Rebels and Outlaws is an activist organization in its infancy, from its spark and start at Elevation years ago. We were out in every Black Lives Matter march this summer. We were out for Pride. We were out for queer liberation. We were out for against API hate. But it is not my place to put my body or voice at the front of most of those movements. I have to step back and let the people whose movement it is be seen and heard, and use my body and my platform as a way to protect and amplify. Don't practice performative allyship. It is one of the reasons why, and you and I have had this discussion, I very rarely, when brands are doing different things, will promote them, because it is what I think we saw after Black Lives Matter, the performative actions of a lot of major makeup brands. There are brands that I will no longer work with because of the disappointing performative actions that they took. At Pride right now, every company in the world is putting Pride t-shirts out there, but where is their money going? Home Depot is an evil organization. Amazon is an evil empire, yet they will put out pride shirts and take dollars from queer people. Shop small, shop real, whatever those movements are. If you are supporting female-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, queer-owned businesses, then you know that there is a genuine need in your generosity. And don't speak about things that you're not going to do. You know, you don't have to talk about every movement. That was really hard for my ego, because people will come out and say, well, you haven't spoken about this or that. And there are some things that am very vocal about, and others that are very personal to me. And so I think that you need to do your own research before you speak out, but don't feel like you should speak out just to join the crowd. You've got to do your research there. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Learn from your mistakes. I put a post up during the AAPI protests where I said, you know, end white supremacy. And I had a lot of friends reach out to me and say, this is like saying all lives matter. You're erasing our experience as Asian Americans. And I stepped back from it and I apologized. I was accountable and I took responsibility and I educated myself. And that was an essential step for me to move forward. Now, my intention was to say, I support AAPI people and that white supremacy is the root cause of the evil. But it was not my place to say those words. Amplify the voices and messages of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Use your platforms, you know, use your opportunities. There are jobs that I will turn down because it should not be my job. And I have that privilege at this point, but I am in a position probably more than some other people to amplify other voices. The Powder Group has always been a place for that. Brands like Makeup Forever, when they were only seen as brands for white people, you know, the Powder Group really helped a lot of brands that were very global in their identity and complexion ranges find that audience and help makeup artists of all identities kind of find their place. So community is great for that. Show up. You've got to do, you know, you've got to show up. You've got to, if you take from any community, you've got to give back to it. And our community is diverse. And so you've got to be inclusive and give back. Apologize when necessary, and be honest and be empathetic and be compassionate and be strong. And just say that just because you learned something in school or in home or in church, that might no longer be a belief system that you feel comfortable with. The bishop of the city that I'm sitting in right now came out against gay pride and said that good Catholics should not participate in any pride festivals. This is a diocese that I not only grew up in, I was the president of the CYO and the Catholic youth organizations for the state. I worked for the Catholic Church here. They paid for some of my education. I have my own issues with things that happen in the Catholic Church on so many levels. But, you know, to step away when my family is so Catholic and this is the leader of their faith, it was brutal for me. You know, it was really difficult, but I had to realize that I have to be me. And I have to say what I say, and I have to educate people the way that I could. But Maya Angelou says, understand illiteracy, but never tolerate ignorance. And so I understand that some people have limitations in what they can learn, but I will never stand silent, especially when it comes to other people. You can call me whatever you want, but I really feel like, you know, it's one of my roles to really kind of push all of these things forward, because when you see yourself in the world for the first time, I think that that's a very powerful moment, you know, and I think that as queer, gay, you know, whatever, we don't see ourselves. There's a meme that's very popular that says, as a, you know, queer kid, you grow up as a version of yourself. And you really don't find that. So many of us move away, of our generations anyway, move away and find ourselves in other cities because we grow up with the fear that we're going to be rejected. And that probably makes us stronger. It probably makes us fighters in some way, maybe tougher, maybe harder, but it also allows us to take the time to become ourselves and do the research and see diversity and experience. And not everyone has that ability. For me, coming back to a small place, where people maybe don't have my privilege of travel and seeing diversity in person and hearing other people's stories, it's my job to educate them, and I think that's okay. And you don't always need to insist, but you can lead by example. You can offer changes in terms. There are small things that you can say and do to make other people feel comfortable and welcome, and that comes with educating yourself and creating safe spaces of inclusion. And I think that the powder group is a good model, and I don't say that just because I'm I'm here with the powder group. I think that to have two old white men kind of leading through this group of freaks and crazies and kooks and conservatives and artists of all types, it says a lot for what this industry allows. And the powder group created community when it was all competition. And if you use that as an example in your own markets, in your own careers, that's a great model. There's a place for everyone here, as long as you are also inclusive and also compassionate and understanding. And I think if you live and lead by example, there's not a lot there where you can fail.
I love that. And I think, I had a conversation with somebody just a couple of days ago, and it was about, as we were entering into Pride, aside from your list of all these incredible and amazing ways that people can show their allyship, or even celebrate their own community, because a lot of trans persons and a lot of, LGBTQ folks of all shapes and sizes and backgrounds don't quite know how, where, or why to communicate and celebrate and share. So I feel like one of the things I talked about, and this was with a cisgender female that I was speaking with, I said, if you're in doubt, look at what your friend who's trans or gay or Asian or Black has posted. And instead of creating your own post, share their post. Talk in their language coming from them, because that allows you to celebrate what they're sharing in their story, but it also allows you to not feel like you might make a mistake. Because if you're sharing someone else's words and energy and you're celebrating them through that share, it's a safe way for you to make sure you're not using, like you said, no one wants to make mistakes. No one wants to feel like they did something wrong. And intention is incredibly important. But in cancel culture, you mentioned earlier, in cancel culture, we know that we don't always have the opportunity to give the background or the explanation, do we? So I think that making sure that if you want to play it safe, using that manner of moving forward is a great way. So much great.
I think it also is important just to say there that if you are sharing other people's things, it has to be amplification.
Of
so
course.
You also need to credit properly. One of the things that happens a lot when people are sharing on social media is that they are not giving credit to the artist or individual who kind of created that. And that is essential to being an ally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also it allows you to show that support for your community in ways that you wouldn't be able to if you were just maybe saying something on your own. It's great. It's a time for people to think. It's a time to learn. And I think that showing support is something that for the powder group community and the beauty industry as a whole, whether you're in the salon side of it, whether you're in the TV and film side of it, whether you're in the education and brand side of it, the great intention is to support. But to your point, supporting with a black square on your Instagram and going back the next morning to your 20% off sale doesn't feel authentic and real. It feels, as you said, it's showmanship. It's telling me, here's what we think we're supposed to do right now. So as an industry, as a brand who might be listening, and as individuals, there's the old, walk the walk and talk the talk, right? You can't speak out of two sides of your mouth. You have to make sure you're committed to it. And I will say this, James, the makeup show, the powder group, whether for good or for bad, we stand for things that are important to us personally. Yep. We stand with brands that support what we feel is important personally. And I think that that's an incredible privilege that we have being small businesses and individuals that are able to take good care of our community as best we can. We're already up after half an hour, so I want to let our audience head out, but I do want to make sure I mention two things. One, because we talked about brands in this session, my attorneys love me to say that the thoughts and ideas of James Vincent are those of James Vincent, not those of the Powder Group or any of our sponsors of the Powder Group Conversations. That having been said, I hope that all of you will follow all of that James has been speaking about in his own personal social media during this time. And as we lead into Pride Month, we are going to be featuring a lot of the LGBTQ community within our social media at the Powder Group this month and on Makeup Magazine, along with our Spring 2021 issue. We're going to be making sure that we're celebrating the LGBTQ community this month, all month long, and the rest of the Powder Group Conversations programs each Wednesday this month will also be featuring LGBTQ artists. So I hope you'll be tuning in with us. I hope you follow James. And James, thank you as always for being such an inspiration to all of us, including especially me and my husband, Brad. We look to you and think, what would James do? How can we be more like James in the
James
way
is
he
burning to the ground. Thank you.
communicates?
I am very excited to be kicking off this Pride Month. Michael and I have so many programs coming up this year, and I feel like these conversations are so essential to our growing as a community and making space for people who have been told there's no space for them. And so I appreciate being asked to be here today. And I know it's not a difficult conversation. It's not the usual love and fluffy stuff that I talk about, but it is essential to growing and to giving other people the love that we have found here in this industry. So thank you, Michael, for the opportunity.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you very much. Everybody, this has been the Powder Group Conversations with James Vincent on inclusivity and diversity. Thank you to our sponsors, as always, Beekman 1802, Senna Cosmetics, Cinema Secrets, Omnia Muse Beauty Pro, and Scandinavia. This program will be live on YouTube starting tomorrow. I look forward to having you guys check it out there. Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, guys.
And happy Pride.
Happy Pride.